Let me tell you something about the law that you might not know. When push really comes to shove, laws are just words on paper. When I first heard about Ross Scott's Stop Killing Games movement, I admit that I was a bit skeptical. As a lawyer, I was primed to think of the movement in strictly legal terms, and in strictly legal terms, well, the odds didn't seem good. And yet, as the movement has persisted and my thinking on it has evolved, I've come to understand that it is a mistake to analyze and observe SKG strictly within the lens of the law. Quoting from John Locke's second treatise on government, section 222, the reason why men enter into a society is the preservation of their property. Whenever the legislators endeavor to take away and destroy the property of the people or to reduce them to slavery under arbitrary power, they put themselves into a state of war with the people, or thereupon absolved from any further obedience. In other words, John Locke was a proponent of if purchasing isn't ownership, then piracy isn't theft. Though of course, being an annoying lawyer, I regret to inform you that piracy has never been considered theft, and is understood legally speaking to be a form of infringement. But I digress. The real point is that it is not sufficient to understand SKG strictly from the legal lens when there is a much wider political context. A domestic political context and a geopolitical context, both of which must be considered when trying to reasonably calculate the odds of SKG succeeding. We must also ask ourselves what succeeding means, because there are varying degrees of success. SKG could achieve everything it asks for and then some, but it could also make some insignificant headway on paper, which then has serious legal ramifications down the road. So here's how we'll break down the odds of success. First, we'll define our terms and understand both what SKG is trying to accomplish and what success might look like in its various iterations. Second, we'll look at SKG from the legal side and see how success in its myriad forms might be difficult due to EU law and international treaties. And third, we'll see how SKG could indeed clear those legal hurdles through political pressure, and what that would take in light of counter-pressure coming in from industry lobbyists. It's a lot to unpack, so let's get started. I'm your host, Mooney, and you're tuned in to Moon Channel. In December of 2023, noted video game publisher Ubisoft, best known for their 2002 smash hit for Game Boy Color and PlayStation, Jim Henson's Bear in the Big Blue House, rather suddenly chose to pull its racing game, The Crew, from digital sales platforms, announcing as well that the game's servers would be shut down a few months later on March 31st, 2024. If this was any ordinary game, it'd be no big deal. The community would persist offline, where LAN events and speedrunners could keep the game alive in perpetuity. Alas, The Crew was no ordinary game, for you see, The Crew required a constant internet connection to play, even in single-player mode. And thus, on March 31st, 2024, with the closure of Ubisoft's servers, The Crew was made permanently unplayable. Shortly thereafter, in April of 2024, Ubisoft began revoking licenses from players who had purchased The Crew, bringing to public light a long-standing but deeply problematic industry-wide practice. The consumer doesn't buy video games, they buy licenses to play video games, and those licenses can be easily revoked. There was quite a bit of outrage over Ubisoft's decision, but it was noted YouTuber Ross Scott, whom you might know best for Freeman's Mind, who spearheaded a campaign called Stop Killing Games. The goal of SKG was simple: petition for governmental action to force game publishers to sustain the playability of their games past end of support. That might mean adding an offline mode or the ability to host private servers, and that's really all there is to it. The fundamental purpose of SKG, taken here directly from the website, is, and I quote, to require video games sold to remain in a working state when support ends and require no connections to the publisher after support ends, while not interfering with any business practices while a game is still being supported. You might see this goal and scoff. Who cares about The Crew anyway? But consider how many games this really touches. Any live service game, any always online game, any gacha game, right? I know all of you, about half of my audience would go into withdrawal without their Umamusume fix. And so as you can see, SKG touches upon a very serious and expansive issue in the video games industry, which makes the stakes for us consumers all the more important. But just what are the stakes? The stated objectives of SKG are sometimes in conflict, and what SKG wants isn't always as clear on the surface as it appears. So before we can judge how likely SKG is to succeed, let's define what success actually means, both in terms of SKG's objectives in isolation and its legal theory in practice. SKG's primary goal is to prevent the destruction of video games. The proposition is, a video game is only a video game if it can be played. If the game is rendered unplayable, it has thereby been destroyed. You, the consumer, have purchased the game, and you should have the right to play it even after the publisher decides to end support. The primary stated goal to prevent the destruction of video games presumes that if a game is not playable, it is, de facto, gone. Kaput. No more. But here's the kicker. By law, video games aren't owned. Not in the United States, nor Canada, Australia, Germany, France, the UK, the EU as a whole, and even Brazil. I've talked about this before, and we'll approach this subject with a different lens in just a moment. But for now, all we need to understand is that video games are licensed, and they are that way because of international trade agreements which bind virtually every country in the world by these provisions. Games are licensed virtually everywhere, and so to prevent the destruction of games, if one defines destruction as removal of playability, and thus removal of ownership, one must also first be able to own the game. If one cannot own the game, then one has no right to protest its destruction, right? As such, as we will see, SKG argues in its legal theory for the ownership of games, even if it states otherwise that it does not. We'll call this pathway to success the hard way. If SKG focuses on this track to achieve its goals, it will be pushing against enormous opposing forces. But if it succeeds, the prize is not merely the playability of games after end of support, the prize is ownership of your own games. The prize is a complete upending of international intellectual property law as we know it, a veritable IP revolution. And depending on how far along SKG gets towards that goal, it will have to contend first with the video games industry and its lobbyists, who see the end of video game licensure to consumers as an industry-wide existential threat. But let's say SKG manages to push through a desperate and cornered unified video game industry lobby. It then has to contend with how the end of video game licensure affects intellectual property as a whole. Video games are not the only things you license. We're talking about everything from plant seeds to pharmaceuticals to microwaves. Virtually everything related to IP is more or less licensed. And while it's already a tough fight to challenge just Ubisoft, taking on the entire video games industry at once is like soloing Melania, Blade of Mikola, naked with a pot on your head. Challenging every single IP-based industry in the world at the same time is like trying to beat a TAS-only Mario World Kaizo level on your first try using a half-broken Dance Dance Revolution pad in the Donkey Kongas. You can see why I call this the hard way. Now to be clear, as my previous videos indicate, I am a proponent of the hard way. I'd love to see IP reform in this direction, in a more consumer-friendly and equitable way. But we must be cognizant and aware of what success means here. If SKG is strictly about allowing games to persist past the end of support, and not about interfering with any business practices while a game is still being supported, then going about things the hard way introduces prerequisite goals to that final objective which are far more difficult than the final objective is in isolation. If, however, SKG has become more than just its stated goals, as it at times purports to be in its verbiage, then any progress, no matter how little, is in my opinion a massive success. The system as it has been built is nearly insurmountable. Unless one has a really good understanding of both international IP law and international relations, it is hard to parse just how enormous of a barrier ownership of games really is to break down, and how many other industries such a legal snowball could envelop. If SKG, for example, can give EU politicians the mandate of the people enough to say, reject American trade pressures which uphold the enforcement mechanisms of international IP law, which is to say sanctions, then this is a mind-bogglingly enormous victory to me. You, the gamer who wants to play Ubisoft's The Crew, may not see it that way, of course. The game still can't be played. But that's why we have to define what success means. If the prerequisite goal to preventing games from being destroyed is securing ownership of the game, even the tiniest crack in this barrier is invaluable, as it is proof that the barrier itself is not invincible. We'll revisit this all in a little bit, but for now, let's talk about the easy way. The hard way is very hard, but there is a so-called easy way to the end goal of keeping video games playable after support ends. You are not, however, going to like it. I will forewarn that while this is surely the pathway most likely to succeed for the stated objective, it is not likely to be emotionally satisfying to the justifiably upset literal millions of gamers who are venting their wider frustrations with global IP law via SKG. If you, the gamer, if you, the SKG supporter, only care about the singular and stated issue of preserving games after support ends, the movement would be much more likely to succeed if it cooperated with the industry and operated as an intra-industry consumer advocacy group instead of as an adversarial political movement. SKG has proven that it can take the fight to the industry. The industry is reacting with some degree of genuine fear. The easy way then is compromise. We have no intention of changing the licensure and ownership of games. We only want games to be playable after end of service. We will work with you to see if we can put our heads together to come up with a solution that is tenable to gamers and publishers alike. In this framework, it is very possible that the outcome does provide some degree of industry-wide accountability concerning post-service game playability, but without accomplishing the entirety of what SKG is asking for. After all, as we say in the legal business, a good compromise leaves everyone unhappy. In this framework, the closer that SKG gets to its stated goal of industry self-enforced standards for post-service game playability, the better. A total victory here might be the establishment of a self-regulatory organization like the ESRB, which acts as a non-profit that supports games after end of service on behalf of the entire industry. In fact, maybe SKG could transition into that non-profit body, acting as a middleman to support instead of oppose the current video game licensure landscape. An industry move this dramatic will require a lot of leverage, and it's likely to leave a sour taste in both SKG supporters' mouths. A lesser victory might be a concession from major publishers like EA or Sony or Nintendo. A legally empty perhaps, but nevertheless substantive promise that they will keep their games playable after end of service from here on out. And the tiniest possible victory might be having Ubisoft allow private servers for the crew. A few people will be happy about it, but most people will groan and shrug and wish that they hadn't given the movement so much attention and time. Yet still, a win is a win, right? So we've taken a look at the easy way and the hard way and developed an understanding of what success looks like. But there is one more way to discuss, and that is leveraging progress along the hard way to facilitate negotiations along the easy way. We're about to begin our descent into the legal abyss here. I'll try to keep things digestible, as there are layers upon layers of complexity and nuance that we just can't get to. I'll do the best I can in the simplest terms I can. As we stated, there are two fundamental paths to success for SKG. The hard way, which involves substantive changes to international IP law, and the easy way, which involves collaborating with the industry instead of pushing for meaningful changes to IP. These two pathways are interrelated. The more that SKG successfully pushes down through the hard way, the more leverage SKG has to enforce its demands if it pivots to the soft way. But this is a game of chicken. The chances of SKG succeeding going down the hard way, as we will discuss in a moment, is exceedingly, incredibly slim. I won't call it impossible, but it'd be like winning the lottery and building your future life around the prospect of that win. That's probably a bad idea, but hey, it could happen. If SKG looks like it might even make marginal progress towards undoing ownership and licensure of video games as currently exists, the industry will be very, very eager to cut a deal. The end goal along the hard way, though, is so difficult, so hard, that eventually it is overwhelmingly likely that SKG will run into a wall and the movement will collapse. If the stone wall of bureaucracy and international trade agreements completely halts the momentum of SKG, the movement has no more leverage and the industry wins a total victory. SKG will then have nothing to negotiate with once it pivots. It's like a game of poker. Or it's like Deal or No Deal, right? You can chase the briefcase with the biggest amount of money in it, or you can compromise and accept the banker's proposal to quit the game. If you chase the biggest briefcase, you are very likely to lose. The closer you get to the grand prize, though, the more the banker is willing to offer you to stop playing the game. If SKG, again, really only cares about the playability of games post-service, then the most effective route is to leverage its progress along the hard way to facilitate its negotiations when it changes over to the easy way. In other words, to speak softly, but carry a big stick. So those are our three routes: hard, easy, and pivot. But astute viewers amongst you may have noticed that there is an expected pathway here that is missing. Wait a second, Mooney. One side is negotiating with the industry to get what you want, the other side is forcing the ownership issue. What about just like forcing the industry to get what we want, but without the ownership issue? I'm sorry to say that this is not likely to be an option on the table. The power of the publisher to control things like a game's end of service is totally reliant on the legal distinctions made between ownership and licensure, and affecting that power through law must necessarily touch on that distinction. This issue has extremely deep legal roots, which makes this complicated to explain, but I'll do my best, starting from the bottom of the roots and working up. This is probably going to be the most difficult legal section of the video, so proceed with caution or prepare to fall asleep. In the United States, Article 6 of the Constitution establishes that the Constitution, the laws of the US, meaning federal laws, and all treaties made are the supreme law of the land. Treaties are no joke. When the United States signs a treaty, it is constitutionally bound to treat it as the supreme law. Now, the European Union works a little differently. There is no supremacy clause, but treaties are nevertheless at the very top of the legal hierarchy. Lest we forget, the EU itself was established by treaty. Article 288 of the TFEU, one of the foundational treaties of the European Union, states that a regulation shall have general application and shall be binding in its entirety and directly applicable to all member states. The member states may choose how to implement the regulation, but the regulation itself cannot be ignored. We then turn our attention to Article 216, paragraph 2 of the TFEU, which states that agreements, which is to say international treaties, concluded by the Union are binding upon the institutions of the Union and on its member states. So if the EU signs a treaty, that treaty becomes the law of the land in the constituent states of the EU. EU law itself, meaning the foundational treaties and primary law of the EU, is at the top of the legal hierarchy, but international agreements concluded by the EU are second place. This means international agreements are both above secondary EU law such as regulations or directives, and that secondary EU law sits above national law. That means if the EU signs a treaty, the terms of the treaty sit above both secondary and national law. And while member states have the right to implement the treaties as they see fit, they cannot ignore any of the provisions of the treaty upon implementation. The issue of ownership and licensure, and the rights that publishers have over IP that derives from that scheme, including the right to render their games unplayable after end of service, is pursuant to treaty, which means there is limited room for interpretation even at the EU level, and very limited room for interpretation at the national level. This is also why so many of the national level endeavors fail or get stonewalled all over the world, even in Brazil. They are bound by treaty and have limited room or desire, quite frankly, to budge. And the treaty I'm referring to here, as you might have already guessed if you watched the previous video, is the TRIPS Agreement. The Agreement on Trade-Related Aspects of Intellectual Property Rights, a treaty designed by American corporate lobbyists to move the power and wealth of intellectual property away from the public and away from developing countries and into their pockets instead. Now, TRIPS enforces a couple of rules in tandem that collectively make it very difficult to maneuver around a publisher's control over IP. There's Article 9, Paragraph 1, which incorporates the Berne Convention, which thereby states in part that authors of literary and artistic works have the exclusive right of authorizing the reproduction of these works in any manner or form. Keep that wording in mind. Language matters, right? Exclusive right, authorizing, any manner. This is the foundational copyright ownership power, and it applies to software, which is protected as a literary work, as per TRIPS Article 10, Paragraph 1. This means the author, here the publisher, has the exclusive right to reproduce the works in any way they see fit, including by licensing. And the last quote-unquote rule we'll focus in on is the strong system of enforcement that TRIPS implements as per Articles 41 through 61. Prior to TRIPS, IP enforcement was rather limp, meaning that even if the less strict rules were broken, the mechanism for enforcement didn't allow for things like trade sanctions between signatories. However, by forcing every member of the World Trade Organization, the WTO, to require strong American lobbyist-dictated strict IP enforcement, the TRIPS agreement makes national governments enforcers for corporate rights at the expense of public welfare. Furthermore, the TRIPS agreement allows any member state to bring a dispute to the WTO's dispute settlement body against any other member state it deems has violated TRIPS. If the violating state loses the dispute, then the TRIPS agreement allows authorized retaliation in the form of trade sanctions. And you'd better believe that the United States has a storied history of utilizing this authorized retaliation to economically crush other nations into obedience and submission. As some of you are well aware, in the European Union, the US sometimes doesn't even bother with the whole authorized bit, as we've seen of late. Remember what I said about laws just being words on paper. In any case, these three TRIPS rules form the roots of this tree. Let's move up one layer to the trunk. Usually when you sell a copy of a work like a book, the rights holder's exclusive distribution right is exhausted. This means they cannot control the resale of that particular copy. In the United States, this is called the First Sale Doctrine, as codified in Section 109A of the Copyright Act. In the EU, this is called the Principle of Exhaustion. Now, TRIPS doesn't dictate a single regime for exhaustion. Article 6 specifically leaves the matter of exhaustion implementation to signatories. This means national or regional law determines whether exhaustion applies to software, which seems like a vector for attack, right? But publishers get around this issue for software through licensing. Licensing specifically exists so that you don't get sold a copy and thus exhaustion never happens. Let's see how this looks, first in the United States. This is going to be a bit of a rehash of the prior video, but in 2010 here in the United States, the Ninth Circuit decided in Werner v. Autodesk Incorporated that secondhand copies of Autodesk's software AutoCAD purchased by Werner could not be legally resold by Werner because he never owned the software to begin with. The lower court initially held that Werner did own the software and cited the First Sale Doctrine. If you buy a copyrighted work, you are then free to sell, lend, or give away that work without the copyright holder's permission. If you buy a book in print, you can donate that book to the library, and Ernest Hemingway can't be like, no, don't do that. The Ninth Circuit, however, held that as the original buyer of the software from Autodesk was Cardinal Technologies, and Cardinal Technologies was a non-transferable licensee and not an owner, the non-existent ownership could not have thereby been transferred to Werner, who had no legal right thereafter to resell the software. You, the gamer, are like Cardinal Technologies. You never even owned the game, and thus, just as you can't give the game over to be legally resold or legally donated to a library, if the playability of your game is defunct, it has also not legally been destroyed by the publisher. For the game itself to be legally destroyable, it must be ownable. But the Court of Justice of the European Union, the CJEU, takes a bit of a different approach to software ownership than we do here in the United States. As we've seen in cases like Ubisoft v. Oracle, the CJEU has held that software sold via perpetual license and downloaded for a lump sum price transfers ownership-like rights to the consumer. Not ownership per se, but the rights of ownership, including copyright exhaustion. There's a lot of nuance there that we just don't have time to get into. The CJEU is essentially saying that you can kinda own software and thus acquire the rights associated with ownership as long as you follow a set of rules. Rule number 1, you pay a lump sum to use the software. Rule number 2, the license gives you perpetual use of the software. And rule number 3, the copy you downloaded is permanently available to you. But the scope here is very narrow, and subsequent CJEU holdings have moved the EU further away from this ruling, not closer to it. This ruling also wouldn't have touched upon video games industry licensure schemes to begin with anyhow, given how narrow the scope is. Video game licenses are specific, limited, non-transferable, etc. In fact, video game publishers have a very clever middleman now, which makes it very difficult to overcome the licensing issue in the EU, even absent other considerations. Why do you think every single publisher has its own launcher or account system now? Why did Sony force you to link your PlayStation account to play Helldivers 2? It's a clever legal trick, and the account acts as a container for your license. Not only do you not own the game, you have a non-transferable license tied to a personal account governed by the account and the platform's EULA. And the EULA always reserves the right to terminate the account or revoke the license under certain conditions. You don't even own the license. You are licensing the right to license. This is in part why I don't consider Valve one of these so-called good guys. They know a lot more about suppressing consumer rights than you do, pal, because they invented it. Subscription models, microtransactions, accounts, and launchers, always online connections, all of these separate you from ownership. And you cannot deprive European citizens of their property if there is no property. To make it very simple, account-bound, non-transferable licenses and service separation is an industry-designed solution that effectively keeps video games outside of the used soft framework. Yet even if, despite all that, you manage to prove that the publisher's rights have been exhausted and that you have ownership-like rights over the game and thus have a right to continue to play the game you bought, you have to deal with games as a service, which create a service software separation. That always online functionality that is seemingly useless and only an irritant is another layer of legal defense. The law would have to also be changed to treat the ongoing service as part of the work. Which is to say, The language of the TRIPS agreement makes it very difficult for even the EU to modify the exclusive rights of the publisher. Yet even if a very niche case of exhaustion could be made, the industry has already been narrowing that exception for years and has developed there, besides, multiple, very powerful, very carefully placed layers of legal defense. And while we can't get into it in this video, most if not all of the digital consumer rights protections that exist in the EU are first and foremost designed to protect European cloud capital, the European industry, from external actors like China or the US. With consumer digital rights a secondary and almost coincidental consideration. But let's say the EU goes ahead anyway and says nuts to your rules and our current IP trajectory. Well, then the United States comes along and threatens you with economically mutually assured destruction that it is absolutely willing to commit to in order to protect its corporate interests and the global intellectual property hegemony of said interests. There is literally nothing the US wouldn't do to protect those interests, as we've seen time and time and time again. And this is all before we get to the glaringly obvious. This all touches very much upon ownership. The power to terminate your game after end of service is inseparable from the issue of control via licensure, which is legally inseparable from the concept of ownership. Every attack vector touches upon ownership in some capacity. Even if you strictly operated with a Ubisoft framework and tried to push ownership-like rights, you are still upturning any business as usual if you succeed in creating licensure exhaustion. Even if we call it ownership-like rights instead of ownership, de facto, you have still done the same thing and affected ownership. Attacking the powers of licensure as a legal construct in any way so as to force games to persist after end of service will interact with ownership. They are two halves of the same legal whole. Which is to say, no. As much as one might want to force the industry to make games playable after end of service without touching upon the ownership issue, it is, to my knowledge, functionally impossible. Well, that was quite the detour, but I hope you found it informative. Still less confusing than understanding a half A-press, if you ask me. But let's get back to our featured presentation, shall we? Let's zero back in on SKG and gauge its strengths and weaknesses with regards to the legal battle ahead. The strengths of SKG are multitudinous. For one, SKG has a lot of consumer support. Millions of people around the world, including around 1.5 million EU citizens, have offered their voices to the movement, and politicians in the industry alike have taken notice. SKG also has at its core a pretty simple and intuitive request. We just want to play the games that we paid for. The motives of SKG are easy to understand and relate to. SKG is also helmed by Ross Scott, a person who genuinely cares about video games and the gaming community as a whole. You can't buy that kind of authenticity and meaningfulness, and the industry has good cause to be concerned. That said, despite the strengths of SKG, there is a pretty substantial rhetorical weakness that astute viewers or listeners may have already spotted, and that relates back to what we've already discussed. Let's take a look together. The very first sentence on the website's homepage is, and I quote, "Stop Killing Games is a consumer movement started to challenge the legality of publishers destroying video games they have sold to consumers." Language always matters, folks. Let's break it down together. When one states, challenge the legality of publishers destroying video games they have sold to consumers, you are framing the movement as, number one, a legal challenge, and number two, surrounding game ownership. Continuing with the homepage write-up, an increasing number of video games are sold effectively as goods, with no stated expiration date, but designed to be completely unplayable as soon as support from the publisher ends. This practice is a form of planned obsolescence and is not only detrimental to consumers but makes preservation effectively impossible. Furthermore, the legality of this practice is largely untested in many countries. Consider this from the perspective of both the industry and any outside adjudicators. The write-up makes a point of identifying video games sold as goods designed to be unplayable as a problem, but in specifically coming at the issue from the perspective of games as goods, you are bringing ownership and licensure into the question. And when you discuss the legality of the practice, informed observers won't necessarily see the smaller problem of unplayable games after end of service, they will see the neon flashing lights of challenging video game ownership rights. We see some similar mixed messaging on the EU petition page. Video games are being destroyed, it states in bold text. Well, what does destroyed mean? As we discussed in the legal context, you don't own the game, you only own the license. Thus, if the publisher pulls the game and terminates your license, as long as it is allowed to do that, which it largely is, your license has been terminated or destroyed, but the game is owned by the publisher, it persists in their archives. It was never destroyed, as you never owned it to begin with. This is semantics, I can hear you say. Everyone understands what SKG is saying. We just want the right to play our video games after end of service, and if the publisher takes that away, that's destroying the game. But it's not that simple. If SKG is going to specifically state that the legality of this practice is largely untested in many countries, if SKG is going to turn to legal mechanisms to attempt to enforce its demands, then the language matters very, very much. Let's consider how the European Commission, the executive branch of the European Union, will consider SKG's points. It's receiving two messages in tandem. On one hand, the movement only asks for video games sold to remain in a working state when support ends, and for said games to require no connections to the publisher after support ends. The movement declares no intention to interfere with any business practices while a game is still being supported. Yet in its rhetoric, on its website, and the musings of its many supporters and benefactors, the movement purports to very monumentally interfere with business as usual. There is almost nothing more interfering for the games industry than a challenge to the intellectual property status quo surrounding ownership. But this is just the website. What about the actual petition submitted to the European Commission? Given what we've discussed and what most of the public understands SKG to be, what is the movement actually asking for on paper? Let's read the filing together. Starting from the top, this initiative calls to require publishers that sell or license video games to consumers in the European Union or related features and assets sold for video games they operate to leave said video games in a functional, playable state. Specifically, the initiative seeks to prevent the remote disabling of video games by the publishers before providing reasonable means to continue functioning of said video games without the involvement from the side of the publisher. This initiative does not seek to acquire ownership of said video games, associated intellectual rights or monetization rights, neither does it expect the publisher to provide resources for the said game once they discontinue it, while leaving it in a reasonably functional playable state. As you may have all noticed, this objective section appears to be completely rejecting the hard way. We don't want ownership rights, it states very clearly. But wait, let's look now at the annex. As per the Annex, SKG cites to Article 17, Section 1 of the Charter of Fundamental Rights of the European Union, which states, "No one may be deprived of his or her possessions except in the public interest and in the cases and under the conditions provided for by law subject to fair compensation." The Annex continues by stating, "This practice deprives European citizens of their property by making it so that they lose access to their product an indeterminate/arbitrary amount of time after point of sale." This is an ownership argument through and through. Who owns the game? All this is to say that by arguing Article 17, Section 1, specifically referencing the deprivation of property, the Annex is taking the hard way and broadcasting it loudly. This argument completely relies on combating the ownership rights that the objectives state is not on the agenda. I'd expect then the European Commission and any industry observers to treat this movement and its filings as if they are 100% taking the hard way. And as we've discussed, if you do take this into the law as opposed to settlement, well, you can't avoid the topic of ownership. Now, it's possible that this mixed wiring is a veiled message to the industry that the movement is willing to negotiate. But if the message is veiled in this way, it's veiled pretty well, and this attempt at messaging may come at the cost of clarity of purpose. So now we understand the risks and potential flaws in the arguments being made. I've played the devil's advocate and I've told you what is and isn't realistic. As such, it's finally time for us to look at what is possible, and what the chances of success really are. There are three paths to victory that we've discussed: the easy way, the hard way, and the pivot. The first is settlement with the industry, the second is full steam ahead on ownership, and the third is pushing the ownership issue to use it as leverage for negotiations. Starting then with the easy way, I actually think that some measure of minor success is already possible if negotiations begin immediately. You remember that scene in Starship Troopers where the guy puts his hand on the brain bug? Well, the industry, it's afraid. Video Games Europe recently released a statement in which it directly addressed SKG. Its words might look gentle, but it's direct opposition, and we can expect that the metaphorical troops are being called up to prepare for war if necessary. We've also seen an anonymous complaint filed against SKG, which we'll go over in a moment as well. But with fear on the table, there is already some leverage for negotiations. That said, I don't think that SKG, at least given present appearances, has the wherewithal to negotiate or leverage its advantage against the industry. The industry combined has some of the best IP lawyers in the world at its beck and call, and SKG does not. That said, SKG has attracted folks with business know-how, for better or worse. Some of SKG's most visible organizers are a business consultant with a background in data analytics and the CEO of an international cryptocurrency exchange company. Just be careful, friends. In my experience, once big money starts to creep into grassroots movements, if the leadership isn't attentive, the grass starts to look more and more like AstroTurf day by day. To be clear, this doesn't automatically make anyone with a background in finance a bad actor, but bad actors often come from finance. Credibility is fragile, and finance by nature is predatory. But I digress. If SKG enters into negotiations now, I don't anticipate that we'll see much more than conciliatory gestures. At present, the industry might be willing to throw Ubisoft under the bus and resurrect the crew for nobody to play so that gamers can call that a win and pat themselves on the back. If SKG chooses to pursue the easy way right now, it will achieve either nothing at all or merely token measures that do not achieve SKG's wider goals. I give the easy way at present only 25% odds of succeeding in anything more than token measures. I think settling for the flimsiest victory possible could have as high as a 75% chance of success, but I highly doubt SKG would be willing to settle for that. The industry is afraid, but it isn't desperate. Yet. It's like the 5 stages of grief, right? We're just past denial and we're entering into anger. If SKG survives anger, it gets to negotiate with a much more cooperative industry, and if it pushes further, it may even get acceptance of its core terms. Which brings us to the pivot. At present, SKG appears to be attempting the pivot, or at least I hope so. The hard way is being pushed in the legal theory that SKG is relying upon and the rhetoric of its language, and the easy way is being pushed in SKG's stated objectives. I think the best way for us to understand the sliding scale of success right now concerning the pivot is to see what the hard way will look like as SKG proceeds and then anticipate how the industry might respond. So far, SKG has achieved what no such movement before has done, accumulating not just 1 million but nearly 1.5 million signatures from EU citizens in support of its petition. This action alone has finally been enough to attract negative attention from the industry in the form of a direct response. Concerning SKG's past actions, every single petition or complaint that has not been rejected is currently in bureaucratic limbo. The industry is happy to wait those out or fight them on an individual basis if anything does arise. Time, in this case, is on the industry's side. They can afford to wait indefinitely, but SKG as a movement fueled by public discontent is limited by the interests of its supporters. Positive results will keep old supporters engaged and attract the attention of new supporters. Bad results can sometimes do the same by stoking anger. But no result. That's really boring and doesn't stoke anyone's feelings, and as such, the longer these processes drag on, the less influence SKG has. That said, as the initiative petition has reached the 1 million signatory threshold, the Commission must respond in a certain time period, and so we have our timeline. First, SKG has 3 months to group the collected signatures by nationality and send them in for verification with each independent nation's authorities. The national authorities then have 3 months to verify how many of the statements are valid and issue a certificate validating those signatures. Once these certificates are issued, SKG has 3 months to submit its initiative to the Commission along with information on the support and funding it has received for the initiative. Keep this in mind for later. Finally, after submission, within 1 month, SKG will meet with representatives of the Commission and be given the opportunity to explain their position. Within 3 months, they will be given the opportunity to present their initiative at a public hearing of the European Parliament, and within 6 months, the Commission will spell out what action, if any, it will propose in response to the initiative and its reasons for taking or not taking action. So altogether, there are 6 steps that must still be taken, and the maximum time these steps could take from beginning to end, at least on paper, is 12 months, 1 year. Our first meaningful barrier is seeing just how many of these signatures are valid. My understanding is that there is quite a substantial fear that many of these signatures on the petition are fraudulent. Maybe some Americans signed the petition using pseudonyms and fake IDs, or maybe they're botted submissions. Well, we'll find out, but I suspect that because the signature overflow is so high, at nearly 1.5 million signatories, and the attention that the movement has gotten is so substantial, the signatures are most likely valid. If SKG clears that hurdle, we should expect the industry to get a bit more anxious. We've already seen the industry react with some anxiety, issuing a public-facing directed statement, but also working behind the scenes against the movement. SKG founder Ross Scott stated on July 21, 2025 that an anonymous complaint was filed with the European Citizens Initiative concerning SKG's source of funds. Ross Scott concludes that this anonymous complaint was likely filed by the industry as an attack on SKG. And, well, I'm inclined to agree. This was a carefully crafted legal weapon. You'll recall that step 1 was the verification of signatures, but that step 2, the one I asked you to keep in mind, is submission of the initiative to the Commission, along with information on the support and funding the initiative has received. The industry is anticipating that step 1 will not be an issue and is fighting back at step 2. This is an organized and thought-out response. If I was handling this matter at, say, Ubisoft Legal, this is also where I'd choose to fight my next battle. Let's look at the complaint together. The complaint alleges that number 1, SKG has falsely declared 0 funding sources, and that number 2, this declaration of no funding is fundamentally incorrect based on documented evidence. So has SKG actually received funding that hasn't been documented properly? What is this documented evidence? The complaint cites to founder Ross Scott's public statements of his work as a strategic decision maker and public spokesperson, how that labor for the campaign has a professional value of 63 to 147,000 euros, and that this labor exceeds the 500 euro reporting threshold for funding sources by 125 to 295 times. The rest of the document just rehashes what has already been stated, though of note, the complaint specifically points out that Ross Scott is American, and as such his unpaid labor constitutes an undisclosed contribution from a foreign source. This is foreign black money funding a campaign against European industry, is the implication. The annoying thing is, well, as far as I've been able to research, there isn't a clear-cut answer as to whether volunteer work constitutes an in-kind contribution, which counts for the purposes of the source of funds disclosures. An in-kind contribution, just to be clear, is a non-monetary donation of goods, services, or resources that has a measurable economic value. And as such, there is some merit to this argument. It has the possibility of succeeding. But what does succeed mean in this case? Well, in the worst case, it would allow the Commission to declare the initiative inadmissible, thus annulling the petition. If that happens, though, there'd be massive public outrage that would likely escape the boundaries of our gaming sphere. The much more likely case is that the Commission will request an amendment to the filing, which would cause, potentially, quite a bit of delay. If the industry continues to deploy these delaying tactics and they succeed, the negotiating power of SKG is reduced relative to its influence. If SKG can clear steps 1 and 2, the verification of signatures and the successful filing of the initiative to the Commission, then the cost for the industry to now fight this out, perhaps by lobbying or other means, rises dramatically, and the risks begin to mount as steps are cleared. It is precisely then when the initiative first clears filing that I'd expect the industry to be willing to bargain, offering promises and perhaps even restoring the crew. The industry might offer a compromise. Ubisoft will get thrown under the bus, maybe. We here at Ubisoft promise to support games after end of service, but only from now on for new games in development. In exchange, the wider industry may request that the initiative be withdrawn in the matter of a settlement. If the initiative clears filing and then starts moving up the ladder uncontested, if, as we will see, the political zeitgeist favors SKG at just the right moment, and the industry finds that its lobbyists are not convincing lawmakers who see in this a far greater opportunity, then in desperation, the industry might offer a self-regulatory body. In the EU. I'm not sure that they go further than that, but even this would be a substantial victory. In truth, I can't even really tell you what the industry would realistically offer, as this is all so unprecedented. That said, if the industry sees that the political winds are not in SKG's favor, and that its lobbyists are producing gains, it may simply elect to ride out the Commission's decision, choosing to roll the dice on the result. As such, for a pivot strategy to succeed, at least by my reckoning, the time to negotiate is either after Step 2 for a small, easy way win, or in the final consideration phases. Settling after Step 2 has a high chance of success, but is not a fulfillment of SKG's core objectives in any meaningful way. It is a token victory. I'd give that token victory a pretty arbitrary 40% chance of success if negotiations are entered into. There are so many variables though, right? I might be misjudging the industry's fear here, which might cause them to reject negotiations altogether. Settling during the consideration phases, just before the Commission releases its response, could be the best time to secure an industry concession, a meaningful one that is, if SKG is willing to play hardball. A meaningful success here could be as high as 50% at the negotiating table, though again, this is a really loose conjecture that presumes a lot. I suspect though that neither side will budge and the Commission will be allowed to publish its response, which has a very high chance of being a dud. Likely at worst, a perfunctory slap on the wrist for the industry or a dismissal of the initiative entirely. If this happens, the industry gets away, pardon the joke, scot-free, and SKG will have to try a different strategy. If negotiations happen at this point, a conciliatory gesture is possible, but it will only likely be slightly more than a token offering, and the chance of the industry offering such is like 33%. Not that likely. All of this having been said, there is a narrow pathway to complete success here that is possible. Though, again, it's very, very unlikely. Let's discuss before we conclude how SKG could possibly succeed along the hard way. Let's pretend for a moment that you're the European Union, and you've watched as Chinese and American tech companies have swallowed up your digital infrastructure and monopolized your people's data. Maybe you're a little disgruntled. You've played by the rules that everyone set out, but now the biggest players aren't following the rules and they're intruding on your cloud capital fiefdoms. You're able to strike back with some domestic policy, but you keep one eye on the international trade treaties that you're a signatory of. No matter how much you desire to protect your cloud capital, you don't want to invoke the ire of the United States, or disrupt the intellectual property status quo, for fear of trade actions or sanctions, even if it might work in your favor to do so otherwise. But let's say, for whatever reason, US trade policy goes completely haywire one day, and out of absolutely nowhere you get slapped with massive trade tariffs and penalties and threats of sanction. What might you do? That would never happen, of course, but what if it did? Well, let me do the Moon Channel thing and tell you a little historical anecdote. In the year 209 BC, there were two army officers of the Chinese Qin dynasty who were ordered to lead their soldiers north in defense of the Yueyang the Yueyang Commandery. However, they were severely delayed by a flood in Anhui, which would make them late to arrive. At the time, in the very legalistic Qin dynasty, the penalty for showing up late to government jobs, no matter the reason, was death. Thus, the two officers, knowing they'd be late, asked each other a simple question. If the penalty for being late is death and the penalty for revolution is also death, then let's revolt. What's the worst that could happen? It was their revolution that snowballed arguably into the collapse of the Qin dynasty thereafter. Why did I tell you this story? Well, if the penalty for acting against American interests to your own benefit is trade war, and the penalty for acting in accordance with American interests to your detriment is trade war, then why cooperate with the Americans to your detriment? Why wouldn't you revolt? What's the worst that could happen? We're not quite there yet, but we could get there if American trade policy continues in this direction. And if it does, the hard way suddenly looks like it might have an avenue to succeed. For you see, SKG scratches at one of the most fundamental pillars, one of the foundational cornerstones of global trade: intellectual property licensure and ownership. And this system was built by and is meticulously maintained by the United States. If the EU wanted to revolt against the system of global trade that America built and that America is now leveraging against it, there happens to be a movement touching upon just this subject gathering some, dare I say, steam. This is a lot of conjecture though, right? I understand, and the outcome of an EU that forsakes American trade policy is not something that I can give you a clear picture of. There are so many variables that I could discuss the matter for 10 hours and we'd only just be scratching the surface. We've been focused in on video games and IP, but there are political considerations including defense, the disguising of prior Cloud Capital Protection Acts as consumer rights acts, industry collaborators like Big Pharma and agriculture that are likely to take the side of American trade policy, and much more. The scope of the issue expands way beyond what this video could possibly cover. At least at present, the EU seems to be kowtowing to American interests. On August 5, 2025, for example, the EU signed a trade treaty with the United States that a European Commission official themselves called, and I quote, less bad, which you will note is not good. This doesn't mean, though, that the EU is just going to accept the new status quo. It will seek other, more reliable partners around the world, and when it can, perhaps it will unshackle itself from American interests. But probably not anytime soon, and very likely not within the lifespan of SKG as a movement. And yet, it could happen. The political tinder exists, and SKG would be a useful spark. The chances of SKG overthrowing the global ownership licensure regime is fleetingly small. I can't even give this any meaningful percentage of success. It's just too unlikely with too many variables. But given the unique set of geopolitical circumstances that SKG finds itself in, success is not impossible, and that perhaps most of all could terrify the industry into a more meaningful compromise. The end of the signature period for SKG is but the beginning of the true fight. As you can see, the odds are heavily stacked against SKG. This is a grassroots David staring down an industry Goliath, and Goliath has built layer after layer of protection against just this sort of legal attack vector. There are some who might say that such a monumental effort is wasted, that a boy throwing rocks from a sling against a heavily armored warrior is foolish. And yet, how does that story end? A chance is still a chance. The line must be drawn somewhere. If we, the consumers, the public, do not draw the line, these corporations will simply push the status quo further and further until the line is eventually drawn. Better than to draw the line here and now to stem the tide of exploitation. Even if SKG completely fails in its objectives, it has already accomplished something extremely important. It has shown the industry that it has pushed too far. It has shown the industry that the frustrations of consumers have reached a boiling point, and that the line can be pushed no further without pushback. The resistance is in and of itself valuable. The vocalized outrage, even if it is suppressed by force, is still heard, and the industry is afraid. So in truth, my answer to the question, how likely is Stop Killing Games to succeed, is that even without having achieved its stated goals, it has already in a much broader sense succeeded. Everything else at this point is but a bonus, and potentially, just maybe, just possibly, to use a European analogy, the penalty kicks might be what takes home the cup. I've been your host, Mooney. You might notice that this video doesn't have a sponsor. I'm trying to phase those out in favor of Patreon, so I appreciate your patience and support. Moon Channel donates 10% of its entire gross revenue to charity, including Patreon and sponsorship income alike. So thank you for watching and supporting the channel. A special thanks to co-creator Larita for the art and to Silva Gunner and Timmy Turner's granddad for the music. Thank you also to Moon Channel's dearly beloved patrons, without whom none of this would be possible. And last, but not least, thank you for tuning in to Moon Channel.